The wind in Bitter Creek wasn't just blowing, it was trying to skin the world raw. It screamed down from the mountains and hit that little town like a slap in the face. It was a dry, mean wind that stripped the paint off wood and the hope from a soul. On this autumn afternoon in 1878, it felt fixin' to tear the town apart. Little tornadoes of dust spun down the main street, dancing a wicked jig. Bitter Creek, Wyoming was a town built on pure grit, not comfort. It was just a handful of gray buildings clinging to the high plains for dear life. The sky above was big and empty, pressing down on everyone. It was the kind of sky that made you feel awful, small, and alone. And inside the church, poor Clara felt the smallest of all. She stood near the altar, her fingers wringing the rough fabric of a borrowed dress. She'd scrubbed floors for 3 months just to earn her keep in this hand-me-down. The dark wool dress fit her all wrong, just like her life right then. It smelled faintly of mothballs and somebody else's sad story. At only 19 years old, the weight of the world was on her shoulders. She'd come out west on a wagon train that took everything she had. Her folks were buried back in Ohio, and her aunt in Cheyenne was gone too. She was left with nothing but a deep, quiet fear she couldn't name. Now, if you've ever felt trapped, you'll understand Clara's story. The townspeople in the pews were watching her, their eyes full of judgment. They whispered that a stray girl with no money was lucky to get a man at all. They had no idea the strength that was hidden inside her. Just then, the heavy oak doors at the back of the church groaned open. The wind howled through the room before the doors slammed shut again. And there stood Silas Thorne, late and covered in trail dust. He was a mountain of a man, tall and broad, moving with a stiff grace. When he took off his hat, you could see the early gray in his dark hair. His face was a road map of the frontier, weathered by sun and hardship. A pale, jagged scar ran down his cheek, a souvenir from a forgotten fight. The only sound in that church was the lonely clink of his spurs as he walked toward her. He didn't look like any groom. He looked like a rancher who just closed a tough cattle deal. He stood beside Clara, a mountain of a man. She could smell the horses, leather, and the dusty wind on him. She kept her eyes down, but his presence was like the heat coming off the hard-baked ground. Reverend Ezekiel Prynne cleared his throat. He was a bony man with a face that had seen too much sun. His eyes were hard as river stones, and he believed a hard life was good for the soul. He looked from Silas to Clara, and he plainly did not approve of this arrangement. This wasn't a marriage of the heart, it was a deal struck for survival. "We are gathered here," the Reverend said, his voice as dry as a creek bed in August. The ceremony was short and to the point. No pretty songs, no fancy words about love. It was just a binding agreement. Silas stood there, stiff as a fence post. When it was his turn to speak, his voice was a low rumble, not used to talking much. "I do," Silas said. Then the preacher's hard eyes landed on Clara. "And do you, Clara? Vance, take this man as your husband?" That was the long and short of it. Clara felt the whole town staring at her. She knew the hard truth of her situation. If she walked out of this church alone, she would starve. It was as simple as that. She stared at the preacher's dusty boots, her hands shaking something awful. She felt like a coyote in a trap. "I do," she whispered, the words getting lost in the air. The ring Silas slid on her finger was a plain gold band, heavy and solid. It felt like a brand, marking her as his property. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the Reverend said, snapping his Bible shut. There was no kiss. Silas just gave a short nod. Then he finally looked right at Clara. His eyes were dark and unreadable under the brim of his hat. He wasn't smiling. A big, ugly work wagon was waiting for them outside. As she stepped out, the wind howled, whipping dust into her eyes. Silas offered a hand to help her up. His palm felt like worn leather, calloused and rough. Clara flinched when he touched her, and he noticed it too. He paused for just a second, then helped her up onto the seat like he was loading a sack of feed. They rode out of Bitter Creek with no one to see them off. The road to the Thorne Ranch was just 2 ruts worn into the endless prairie. The silence between them was bigger and louder than the whole wide-open country. The only sound was the harness rattling and the wagon wheels groaning. Silas just watched his horses, handling the reins like he was born to it. Clara stared straight ahead, her hands knotted up in her lap. The land out here was beautiful and terrifying all at once. The setting sun painted the clouds a bruised purple and orange. All that open space made Clara feel completely exposed. Back in Ohio, you had trees and fences. Out here, there was nothing but distance. A skinny gray wolf watched them from a ridge about 100 yards off. Then it just melted back into the brush. "We've still got a ways to go," Silas said, making her jump. "About 2 more hours." Clara just gave a little nod, not trusting her own voice. He didn't try to talk again. He seemed just fine with the quiet. Or maybe he didn't know what to say to a stranger either. He was 42, a widower who'd buried his wife and baby boy 10 years before. He'd been alone ever since then, and his heart had grown as hard as the land he worked. He needed a wife for the ranch, plain and simple. A man cannot run 3,000 head of cattle, keep a house, and raise up an heir all by himself. It was a practical arrangement. But looking at her, she seemed so young and scared, just a slip of a girl. A little bit of doubt started to creep in. She looked like she could break, and this Wyoming land broke everything. It was pitch dark by the time they pulled up to the ranch. The house was tucked in a little valley, sheltered by some old cottonwood trees, all twisted up by the wind. It was a tough-looking house made of logs, weathered gray as bone, with a big stone chimney right in the middle. A barn was off to one side. A few horses were sleeping in the corral. A windmill groaned, a lonely metal screech in the night air. The whole place felt like years of hard, lonely work. There was nothing pretty about it. No flower beds or painted shutters. This was a place built to survive. Silas pulled the team to a stop. "You go on inside," he said. "Doors open. I've got to see to the horses." Clara climbed down, her legs feeling stiff as boards. She pushed open the heavy front door. It was warm inside, holding the heat from the day. A single kerosene lamp was burning low on a table. Clara looked around the main room. It was clean, but there was not much to it. A simple table, 2 chairs, a rocker by the fireplace, and a big cast-iron stove. The windows had wooden shutters, but no curtains. The whole place smelled like wood smoke, coffee, and that dusty, lonely smell of a man living on his own. She just stood there in the middle of the room, feeling like she did not belong at all. This was his world now, and she was just the newest addition. When Silas came in 20 minutes later, he brought the night's chill in with him. He hung his hat and washed his hands, the water splashing loud in the dead quiet room. "I reckon you are hungry," he said, drying his hands. "I can cook," Clara said real fast. Her voice sounded tiny. "I know how." "Just sit," Silas said, and his voice was firm but not mean. "You have had a long ride." That first supper was a mighty awkward affair. They sat across from each other, quiet as could be. The stew was just beef and potatoes. Clara ate because she knew a body had to eat, but every bite tasted like ash in her mouth. The clink of her spoon sounded like a pistol shot. Silas ate like a man who was used to eating by himself, his eyes glued to his plate. But every so often she felt him look up at her, sizing her up. "Wind's picking up," he finally said. "Yes," she replied. "It gets real loud in the winter." "You get used to it," he answered. The talk died right there, smothered by what was coming next. This was their wedding night. She'd been taught this was her duty, the price for a woman's security. Silas just cleared the plates. He moved slow and steady. He picked up the lamp and gave her a look. "The bedroom is through here." Her legs felt shaky as she stood up. She followed him into the little room off the main cabin. A big iron bed with a heavy quilt took up most of the space. A small washstand stood in the corner. Silas set the lamp on a crate, making shadows dance on the log walls. He turned and faced her. His size seemed to shrink the small room. He looked at her simple gray dress, buttoned up to her chin. "I'll turn my back," he said quietly, "while you get ready." He faced the wall, his broad shoulders stooped. Clara's fingers fumbled with the buttons. Her heart hammered in her chest like a trapped bird. She changed into her shift, and the cool air gave her goosebumps all over her arms. She climbed into bed, pulling the quilt up tight. "I am ready," she whispered. Her eyes shut tight. Silas turned around. He had taken off his coat and his boots, but was otherwise still fully dressed. He blew out the lamp. The room went dark, except for the moonlight slipping through the shutters. The mattress sank under his weight as he sat on the edge of the bed. Clara forgot to breathe. She could feel the heat from him, the solidness of him. He swung his legs up and lay down beside her. For a long while, he didn't move an inch. Then she felt his large, heavy hand on her shoulder. She knew he was trying to be a husband, trying to be gentle and do what was expected. He was trying to claim what was his by law. But when he touched her, a terrible memory took hold. It was a feeling more than a picture. The smell of whiskey, of being trapped in a corner by rough hands. It was that man from the wagon train who had backed her into a corner. That awful, helpless feeling. It all came rushing back like a flood. Clara flinched away from his touch with all her might. She curled up into a tight ball, her whole body rigid with fear she could not control. Silas moved in closer, his hand now firm at her waist. "Clara," he said, his voice low and raspy, "there is no need to be afraid." But the fear was a living thing inside her as he leaned over. She shut out the faint light and felt panic rise like a storm in her chest and belly, sharp as a knife. This wasn't just shyness, it was pure terror, freezing her solid. She scrambled back and pressed against the cold log wall, clutching the quilt close. "It hurts," she gasped, the words ripping loose from her throat. Silas stopped dead, looming over her like a dark shadow. He hadn't touched her, just hovering there, but she trembled so hard the bed rattled. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears spilling out hot and raw. "It hurts. I'm sorry. Maybe tonight or some other night. I just can't, please." Her voice broke at the end, begging for mercy. Silas stayed frozen, the moment stretching out forever. He could feel her terror like heat from a fire. He was a man with needs, waiting years for a wife, paying for the ring and ceremony. Society said he deserved this. But hearing her cry, broken and scared, cut through his want like a blade. Shame crashed over him hard. He felt old and monstrous, like he'd scared a child. He pulled back slowly. The mattress groaned as he shifted away. Sitting at the bed's edge, he covered his face with his hands, head bowed low. Silas stared into the shadows, feeling the sting of rejection burn heavy in his chest. Was he that repulsive, so scarred no woman could bear his touch? Or was she broken in ways he couldn't see? Her muffled sobs came from the pillow as she tried to hide her tears. He looked down at his hands in the dark. He could force her. The law was on his side, and folks in town expected it. But Silas Thorne was hard, not cruel. He stood up. The floorboards creaked under him. Clara flinched, expecting anger or worse. "Sleep," he said flatly, voice empty but hiding the storm inside. He didn't leave or head to the barn. Instead, then, he lay back on the quilt, fully dressed, turning his back to her. He moved to the very edge of the mattress, leaving a wide, cold space between them. He stared at the moonlight, casting shadows on the wall, and listened to the wind rattling the house, trying to break in. His mind wandered to the cattle to check at dawn, the fence down in the north pasture, and the son he'd hoped to teach how to ride. Tonight, that dream felt miles away. Beside him, Clara cried herself into fitful sleep, her body curled tight in defense. Silas stayed awake for hours, listening to her breathing and the lonely plains weight settling over them both. Morning came cold and bright, showing the hard truth of the new day. Silas was gone before Clara woke. The coffee pot sat warm on the stove, and a note on a scrap of brown paper read, "Back at noon." Clara moved through the morning in a fog. She splashed cold water on her face, stripping the bed. The sheets were still clean. The whole marriage was a lie. Outside, the ranch stirred to life. Jeb, the ranch hand, a wiry man missing a tooth, was already hard at work. The fence down in the north pasture weighed heavy on Silas's mind. He dreamed of the boy he wanted to raise, teaching him how to ride. But that hope felt miles away tonight. Next to him, Clara sobbed herself into a tired sleep, her body curled up tight like she was ready to defend herself from the world. Silas lay there for hours, wide awake, hearing her steady breathing and feeling the loneliness of the vast plains seep into the room, even thicker than before. The sun came up cold and clear the next morning, shining its harsh light on the hard truth of the day. Silas was already gone before Clara opened her eyes. She saw the coffee pot still warm on the stove and a note scribbled on a torn piece of brown paper that read, "Back at noon." Clara moved through the morning like in a fog. She splashed cold water on her face, shocking herself awake. She stripped the sheets from the bed. The sheets weren't dirty. The lie of their marriage hit her hard in that quiet moment. Outside, the ranch started buzzing to life. Jeb, the ranch hand, a lean man missing a tooth, was already at work. Unsoiled. The marriage was a lie. Outside, the ranch came to life. Jeb, the ranch hand, a wiry man with missing Jeb, a fellow with eyes that saw everything, strolled by the bedroom window to get a tool. He peeked through the shutter and saw the bed, perfectly made. Silas clearly had not slept there. It was all too neat for a wedding night. He chewed his tobacco, then spit a long stream into the dirt. He remembered seeing Silas ride out at dawn, his face hard and quiet as a stone. Jeb couldn't help but grin. He had a story, and in a place like Bitter Creek, a good story was worth more than gold. By the time Jeb got to town for supplies, that story was just itching to be told. So he told the blacksmith. The blacksmith told the grocer, and the grocer's wife told Mrs. Gable. Before noon, the whispers were everywhere. They said she wouldn't let him near her, that he slept in a chair. Some wondered if she wasn't as pure as she seemed. The church ladies at their sewing circle nodded their heads, looking awfully satisfied. They knew it all along. A girl from nowhere with no family to speak of. A bride who couldn't be a proper wife on her own wedding night. That just was not natural. She was cold, folks said. She was strange. The wind carried the gossip right along with the dust. It swirled around the lonely ranch house where Clara stood, watching the empty road. She had no idea that the town she worried about had already made up its mind about her. Up in that high country, time just seemed to stretch on forever. The days just piled up, one on top of the other, a slow grind of sun and shadow, wind and dust. The grit seemed to settle on her skin, getting through even the tightest sealed windows. The daily routine was a tough boss. It all started before the sun even thought about coming up, in that cold, blue-gray light of early dawn. Clara learned to wake up to the sound of Silas's heavy boots hitting the wooden floor. The mornings were so cold it felt like it settled deep in your bones and wouldn't leave until midday. She'd shiver while buttoning her dress, her fingers stiff and clumsy, as she listened to Silas working the stove. He'd be in the other room stoking the coals from the night before, getting the fire going. Cooking was her first big challenge. That old cast-iron stove was a mean one, and it would puff smoke right back at you if you did not get the flue just right. Clara burned her hands 3 different times in that first week alone, leaving angry red marks on her knuckles. She learned to mix biscuit dough by the weak light of a lamp, her arms aching from all the kneading. She'd pray the oven was hot enough to make the bread rise, but not so hot it'd scorch the bottoms. Breakfast was always quiet. It was just strong coffee and salt pork. Silas ate like he worked, all business, with no wasted motion. His eyes were always on the window, watching the sky brighten. He was thinking about the ranch, about water, and about wolves. Clara would watch him, trying to understand what he was thinking, but his face gave away nothing at all. After he left, the house would fall completely silent. It was not a peaceful silence, though. It was a heavy, waiting kind of quiet. Clara's days were a constant battle. Hauling water from the well was hard work. The task left her out of breath, her shoulders screaming from the strain. The old pump would shriek every single time. Each pump of the handle was a struggle, a real fight for every drop of water. She hauled the heavy buckets back, cold water sloshing over and soaking her skirt. Laundry day was even tougher. Her hands were raw from the harsh soap. She battled the wind just to hang clothes, that prairie gale snapping them like a whip. One afternoon, a sheet broke free, and she had to go chasing it across the sagebrush. She finally caught it, a quarter-mile out, covered in dirt and feeling defeated. Holding that dirty sheet, she just stood there, looking at this new, hard world. The land was beautiful but unforgiving, all cracked earth and endless grass. To the north, the big buttes looked like old, broken-down churches against the sky. The river to the south was a lazy brown ribbon, a winding scar on the land. But Silas had warned her it could rise 20 feet in a flood and wash it all away. Storms out here didn't just show up, they ambushed you. A blue sky would turn to a bruised purple wall of clouds in an instant. Rain came down in sheets, turning the dust to mud that you could not walk through. Then, just as fast, it would be gone, leaving the air smelling of rain and wet sage. This was a land that did not care one bit if you made it or not. Clara was scared she wasn't strong enough, but she was determined to try. She found some old feed sacks in the barn, the fabric rough as a cob. She washed them until the logos faded and stitched them into simple curtains. They weren't fancy, but they softened that harsh sunlight coming through the windows. At night, she mended Silas's torn work shirts by the dim light of the lamp. She darned his socks, weaving new wool over the holes his boots had made. It was her way of earning her keep, but it felt strangely personal too. She decided to start a little garden by the kitchen door to make the place a home. The ground was hard as rock, and she spent hours pulling up stones. She planted the few seeds she'd brought all the way from Ohio. She carried water to them bucket by bucket, protecting the tiny sprouts from the wind. Her hands got rough and her nails broke, stained by the soil of this new territory. But when she saw the first little bean vine curl around its stake, she felt a real pride. Silas noticed. He didn't say a word, but she could see it in his eyes. He started noticing her handiwork, like the curtains she sewed. Slowly, they began to talk about more than just chores. "This coffee's mighty fine this morning," he said, pausing on the porch. "Just an old trick," Clara said. "An eggshell takes the bitterness out." He just nodded. "Well, it works." He squinted at her in the sun. "It's a sight better than that tar I was brewing." It was a small thing, but it was a bridge built between them. Then one morning, a red hen flew the coop, and Clara gave chase. She was worried a coyote would snatch it, but that chicken was fast. Clara lunged, missed, and sat down hard right in the dust. The hen clucked from the barn roof, and Clara figured he'd be angry. Instead, Silas was leaning on a fence post, his shoulders shaking with laughter. It was a rusty sound, but it was real. "She's quicker than she looks," he called out. Clara felt her face get hot, but then a little giggle escaped her too. Defeated by a chicken. "I'll get her when it's time for corn," she said, dusting off her dress. "You do that," he said, and a real smile softened the hard lines of his face. But the softness of the day always gave way to the tension of the night. Their bedroom was a silent struggle. Still, Silas was a patient man. He never pushed or demanded anything. But his hope hung heavy in the air. He'd blow out the lamp, and in the dark, he would reach for her. His touch was careful now, like he thought she was made of fine glass. But Clara would just lie there, stiff as a board, her eyes wide open. She wanted so badly to be the wife he needed, the one who could give him a son. But the moment he held her close, an old fear snapped shut like a trap. Her body remembered what her mind fought so hard to forget. It remembered being helpless, and the panic would just take over. Her muscles would lock up tight, and her breath would catch in her throat. Silas would freeze right away. "It hurts," she would whisper. "I'm sorry, I can't." It was a lie, and she knew he could tell. There would be no later. He would pull back and roll over to his side of the bed, and in the heavy silence, she could feel his frustration burning across the mattress, and full of shame. Silas lay there, just staring up at the ceiling, a hot anger twisted in his gut. He was mad at the whole mess, and lonelier now than he had been before she arrived. He saw her little shape under the quilt, so small and scared. Why in the world did he marry her? He just wanted a real partner. He wanted some life in this empty house and a son to leave this land to. He needed all his sweat and blood to mean something. Then he started thinking of Martha. His first wife had been all laughter and softness, a woman who always met him with open arms. He remembered the night he lost her and the solemn vow he made right then and there. He promised he would never let another woman suffer because of him. And here he was, scaring this poor girl to tears. He felt like he was betraying Martha and the decent man he always tried to be. He wanted Clara, Lord knows he did. But her deep fear turned his own need into something that felt like a weapon. He realized with a sinking heart he did not know her at all. Not past her cooking and her sewing. He could not see the source of the deep wound that hurt her so. He knew it was not just shyness. It was a scar on her soul, as real as the one on his face. 2 weeks later, it was time to go to town. They rode into Bitter Creek to get supplies. Clara sat up straight on the wagon seat. She wore her best bonnet, trying her best to look like a proper rancher's wife. Silas left her at the general store with a list while he went to see the blacksmith. The store was cool and smelled of pickle brine. Clara moved through the aisles, gathering flour and sugar, feeling the eyes of the other women right on her back. It was Mrs. Higgins, the mayor's wife, and that sharp-nosed Mrs. Gable, the town's biggest gossip. They started whispering when she got close, but just loud enough for her to hear every word. Their words were like little poison darts. "I hear the bed linens stay perfectly neat," Mrs. Gable murmured. "Well, that is not natural," Mrs. Higgins agreed. "A man like Silas Thorne has needs, you know." "She must be broken or she was ruined back east," Mrs. Gable whispered with a mean little smile. "Used up. That is why she is out here, pretending to be pure, too scared to let a husband find out the truth. Some women are just cold as a creek in January." The words hit Clara like a punch to the gut. A hot shame burned her face. Is that what they all thought? Is that what Silas thought? She dropped a spool of thread, and it rolled right to Mrs. Gable's feet. The woman looked down, then gave Clara a tight, pitying smile. "You look pale, dear," she said. "Is married life not agreeing with you?" Clara snatched the thread, her hands shaking. "I am fine," she said. Her voice trembled as she fled the store, leaving half her list behind. She felt dirty and completely exposed. The town felt like a courtroom that had already found her guilty. Silas saw her in the wagon, her face pale and her hands clenched. "What's wrong?" he asked. "I need to see the doctor," she said, her voice full of desperation. She figured if something in her was broken, maybe a doctor could fix it. Silas didn't like it, but he turned the horses toward Dr. Albright's office. Dr. Albright was a man made hard and cold by the frontier. He smelled of medicine and old tobacco. In his chilly office, his hands were rough and his questions were sharp. He asked personal things about her pain that made her want to disappear. "There's nothing wrong with you physically, Mrs. Thorne," he said, sounding bored. "You're just high-strung. Women tend to make a fuss." He told her to relax and advised her husband not to be so gentle. He said sometimes a man just needs to be firm to get the job done. Then he handed her a bill and a private note for Silas. Clara took it, feeling smaller than a field mouse. To that doctor, her terror was just a stubborn door that needed to be forced open. She walked back to the wagon where Silas was waiting for her. He saw the devastation on her face and knew something was wrong. "What did he say?" She just handed him the folded note, staring straight ahead. Silas read the doctor's messy handwriting. It said she was hysterical and needed a firm hand. He read it a second time, his face turning hard as a rock. He looked at Clara, hunched over like she was waiting for a hit. He saw her complete and utter shame. Silas hated a lot of things, but he hated being told what to do with what was his. And he hated that man talking about his wife like she was some piece of property. He crumpled the note in his giant fist and struck a match on the wagon wheel. He set that piece of paper on fire and ground the ashes into the Texas dirt. "Let's go home," he said. The ride home was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet now. It was filled with unspoken understanding. Clara expected him to agree with the doctor, but he never said a word about it. They got back to the ranch as the sun went down, with the lonely wind starting to howl. Automatically, but her hands were shaking so hard she dropped the pot lifter with a loud clang. She froze right there. Then it all came pouring out. She turned to Silas, tears just streaming down her face. "He made me feel so worthless," she sobbed, the words tumbling out. "He looked at me like I was a thing, like some broken piece of farm equipment. He told me you ought to just take what you wanted." She hugged herself tight. "I am so scared, Silas. Not of you. I know you are a good man, but I am afraid of being used up. Afraid I will just disappear and become nothing but a body again." "Like before," she whispered and slapped a hand over her mouth. Silas just stood by the table, quiet. He had taken off his coat, and he looked at her, really looked, with all his own anger gone. He just saw the raw panic of a trapped animal. He walked over real slow, keeping his hands to himself. He stopped about 3 feet away, giving her room. "Clara Wanyara," he said, his voice as deep and steady as the earth. "I burned his note," Silas stated plainly. Clara looked up, her eyes wide. "I don't take orders from Dr. Albright, and I don't take what is not offered freely." He took a step closer, watching her eyes carefully. When she did not pull back, he took another. "I married a wife, Clara," he said. "I did not buy livestock. If that man thinks I would hurt you to get my way, He does not know me. I am sorry if I ever made you feel that way. He paused for a second. I will not send you away, Clara, no matter what happens. Even if we never have a son, even if the whole town talks, you are my wife. You have a home here, and you are safe here. The words were a promise he would never break. He was telling her she had value just by being herself. Clara let out a little sob that was almost a laugh. The tension that held her so stiff just snapped. She started to fall, and he was there to catch her. He did not pull her close or try to kiss her. He just wrapped his arms around her shoulders and held her up. She buried her face in his wool shirt, smelling the scent of tobacco, horses, and just him. He felt as solid as an old oak tree. That night, things were different between them. Silas blew out the lamp. He lay on his back looking at the ceiling instead of turning away. Clara lay beside him. The space was still there, but it was not a canyon anymore. It was just a little gap. She felt his hand rest on the quilt between them. Slowly, she reached out her own hand. Her fingers brushed his knuckles. He did not grab her. He just turned his hand over, palm up, an invitation. She placed her hand in his. His big fingers closed around hers, a hold that promised to protect, not to own. Outside, the wind howled and battered the house, screaming across the dark prairie. But inside, under that heavy quilt, Clara felt a strange and quiet peace growing inside her. The fear was not gone, but it was not in charge anymore. She closed her eyes, feeling safe for the first time in a long while. In that church, she learned what men could do and was no longer afraid of the dark. "Good night, Silas," she whispered. "Good night, Clara," he said. She fell asleep holding his hand, feeling safe as the storm raged on. The spring of 1879 did not bring them any peace. Instead, a scorching heat came early and sucked all the moisture from the earth. The creek, which should have been rushing with water, was just a slow trickle of mud. The sound of the wind changed. It stopped whistling and started to hiss, dragging sand across the land. You could feel the tension in the valley, as heavy as the heat itself. Down at the store in Bitter Creek, men talked low about water rights and cutting their herds. Several smaller families had already packed their wagons and given up. But where most folks saw ruin, Hiram Sterling saw a golden opportunity. He was a man of silk vests and polished boots who owned the bank, the hotel, and the Double Bars Ranch. He was not a man who shouted. He whispered, and his whispers moved property lines. One Tuesday, Sterling sat in his bank office looking over a pile of deeds. He paused when he came to the one for the Thorn Ranch. It was a fine piece of land, with the only year-round spring in that part of the county. That was water Sterling's own thirsty herds would be needing very soon. Sterling knew all about the loan Silas's father had taken out 20 years ago. He also knew about a tricky little clause in that old paperwork. It said, if the owner died without a legitimate child, the land went back to the bank. Sterling smiled a thin, tight smile. He had been listening to the town rumors. Everyone knew Mrs. Gable had a long tongue, and she said the Thorne marriage was just for show. The girl was still skittish as a new colt. There was no heir because there was no real marriage, and in the eyes of the law, a marriage that was not complete was no marriage at all. He figured it was only a matter of time. But the weather had other ideas. 2 days later, the heat did not break with rain. It broke with a terrible violence. The sky turned a sickly, bruised green, and the temperature fell 40 degrees in an hour. It was a late spring blizzard, the kind the old-timers feared more than anything. Silas saw it coming from the north pasture and rode for the house, yelling for his men. "Get the calves in," Silas roared over the wind. "Get them behind the barn." Clara was in the kitchen when the first chunk of hail hit the roof like a hammer blow. On the shingles, she looked out into a world of white and saw Silas in the swirling snow. He was struggling to turn the terrified heifers toward the corral as his horse fought the wind. Jeb was gone, likely cut off. Without a second thought, Clara grabbed her heavy wool shawl. She threw it over her head and pushed the door open, the wind nearly ripping it from its hinges. She should have stayed safe inside, but she saw a calf separated from its mother and stumbling. It was headed for the creek bed where the snow would bury it. So Clara ran right into the cold. The air stole her breath and hail stung her face. She reached the calf, trying to shove it back, but the animal was heavy and panicked. Go on, she screamed, her voice lost in the wind. Suddenly the ground started to shake. A dozen steers, blinded by the storm, came stampeding. They were headed straight for her. Clara froze, seeing the massive dark shapes in the white. They were a wall of muscle and bone. She squeezed her eyes shut, ready for the worst. Curling over the calf, she waited. Then a different force slammed into her from the side. It was not a steer. It was Silas. He had jumped from his horse and tackled her into the mud. He rolled them both under the corral fence just as the herd thundered past them. Their hooves hit the mud just inches from their heads. They lay there, tangled up and panting. The roar of the cattle faded. Silas scrambled to his feet, pulling Clara up with him. He shook her, his grip tight on her arms. His face was pale and his eyes were wild with fear. "What were you thinking?" he shouted, his voice cracking. "You could have been killed, woman." Clara trembled from the cold and the shock. I I just saw the calf." "To heck with the calf," Silas roared. He was shaking all over with adrenaline and terror. "I do not care about the calf. I care about you." He stopped short, realizing he was screaming, and she was scared of him, not just the storm. All the anger left him at once. He pulled her against his chest and held her tight. His arms wrapped around her, shielding her from the wind. "I am so sorry," he gasped into her hair. "I am sorry. I thought they had you. I thought you were gone." Clara just stood there in his arms. She could feel the wild, thundering beat of his heart against her cheek. He was not angry about the livestock. He was terrified of losing her. "Let's get inside," he said, his voice rough, "before we both freeze solid." That evening, the house was a warm fortress. The fire roared, chasing away the cold from outside. They had saved most of the herd, but lost 3 calves. They sat together, wrapped in blankets. Her hair was drying in damp curls around her face. Her skin was tingling. She just looked at Silas. He stared into the fire, a mug of whiskey in his hand, looking bone-tired. Clara felt a sudden, fierce need to protect him. He had risked it all for her. She walked over and stood right behind him. She put a hand on his shoulder. "Silas," she said softly. He looked up, his hand covering hers. "You ought to get some sleep, Clara," he said. "It's been a long day." She didn't move. A powerful gratitude mixed with a new feeling inside her. She needed to show him he had not made a mistake. She wanted to be the wife he deserved. "Come to bed," she whispered. Silas went perfectly still. He searched her face and saw the same old fear lingering in her eyes. But he saw something new too. Determination. "Are you sure?" he asked. "I want to try," she said. They went to the cold bedroom and got under a mountain of quilts. The storm outside made them feel like the only 2 people left in the world. Silas was gentle. His warm, rough hands moved slowly, tracing her jawline. He kissed her softly, a quiet question. Clara listened to his heartbeat. He saved me. He is safe. She tried to let her guard down, to finally unlock that door inside her. She felt a tiny flicker of warmth. But as his touch became more real, the panic returned. The old terror gripped her, and her body seized up tight. The memory of being helpless washed over her. She gasped, and her hands flew up to push him away. "It hurts," she whispered, her voice choked with tears. "Silas, I cannot." He stopped instantly, resting his forehead on hers. He was not angry, but she could feel the heavy weight of his defeat. Clara started to sob, her whole body shaking. "I am so sorry," she wept. "I am useless. You should just send me away." Silas pulled back, his brow furrowed. "What?" "You should let me go," she cried. "Find a woman who is not broken. You deserve a good wife. You deserve sons. I am just a burden, and I am ruining your life." She waited for him to agree that he had made a bad bargain, but Silas just sat up. He looked down at her, his face stern. "Is that what you think? That I bought you like livestock? That I can just trade you in because you are hurting?" He took her face in his hands. "Look at me. I did not choose a body, Clara. I chose you. I chose the woman who can plant a garden in the dust. I chose the woman who would run into a blizzard to save a calf." He wiped a tear from her cheek. "I am not going anywhere," he said firmly, "and neither are you. We will figure this out, even if it takes 10 years or forever." This was not a trade. Clara just stared, stunned. He offered a loyalty she felt she had not earned. She buried her face in his chest. and he held her tight while the storm passed. His patience was a rock for her to lean on. In 2 days, the snow melted. The ranch turned to mud, then back to dust. A week later, a fancy buggy rolled up the road. The passenger was Hiram Sterling, looking all important. Silas was out mending the corral. He stood up straight as the buggy stopped, his hammer hanging by his side. Clara came onto the porch, wiping flour from her hands as Sterling stepped down. He dodged the horse droppings like he had done it 1,000 times and tipped his hat to Clara. "Mrs. Thorne." "Silas," he added. Silas cut him right off. "What do you want, Hiram?" He did not invite the man any closer. Sterling gave a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. "Just a neighborly call. Heard you lost a few cattle." "A few," Silas said flatly. "We will recover." Sterling walked over to the fence. He ran a gloved hand over the rail. "With this drought, money is tight for everyone." He then turned to Clara. She looked awfully thin in her simple dress, the worry of the past few months showing on her. You could see the sharp lines of her collarbones. "You are looking a bit frail, Mrs. Thorne," Sterling said. "This country is hard on a woman, especially one used to a softer life." "I am stronger than I look, Mr. Sterling," Clara said, though her voice shook a little. Sterling's eyes dropped to her waist. "No happy news yet, then? No little ones on the way?" Silas stepped right in front of Clara, shielding her. "My wife's health is not your concern. State your business, Hiram, or get off my land." Sterling put his hands up, pretending to surrender. "So touchy, Silas." "I only meant that with no heir to work this place, the bank is always willing to make a good offer. It might be better to sell now. Find your wife a comfortable life somewhere easier." "There is nothing complicated about it," Silas gritted his teeth. "This land is not for sale." Sterling stared at him for a long moment, his eyes cold as ice. He finally gave a slow nod. "As you say, but you should check your deeds, Silas. Life is full of fine print." He tipped his hat and left. As the buggy drove off, Clara felt a deep chill. Fine print. It was the way he had looked at her. It was like he knew her secret shame, knew that she was the weak spot that could cost Silas everything. 2 days later, that shame hit her right in the face. Silas had sent her into town with Jeb. She was to pick up a part for the windmill. While Jeb was at the blacksmith, Clara went to the post office. That is when she saw two men outside the saloon. One was Grimes, a big man who rode for Sterling. He was laughing a loud, ugly laugh, and he made sure his voice carried. "I'm telling you," Grimes said, as they crossed the street. Sterling figured that deed was worthless if they did not have a child. "And there will not be one," the other man snickered. Grimes sneered. "Why not? Silas is strong as an ox. But that girl, I hear she freezes up like a spooked doe. Or maybe she is not as pure as she lets on. A woman who cannot please her husband often has secrets, damaged goods. That is what she is." Clara stopped right there in the street. The words hit her like a slap in the face, damaged goods. Secrets. They were talking about her body. They were laughing at her pain, and they were saying she would make Silas lose his ranch. She turned and nearly ran back to the wagon, her face burning with a shame so hot it made her head spin. She climbed onto the seat and just sat there, shaking, staring down at her hands. They were right. She was the poison in their well, the reason trouble was coming. She could not bring herself to tell Silas what she heard. The shame was just too deep. But that evening, a desperate idea took hold inside her. She served Silas his supper, her hands shaking the whole time. She cleaned that kitchen till it shined, fighting for their future. She had to fix this. She had to be a real wife. The doctor said to push through it. Maybe she was just being weak. Later that night, the bedroom felt hot and small. Silas sat on the bed, unbuttoning his shirt. He looked plumb tuckered out. Clara stood in front of him and took a deep, shaky breath. She reached out a trembling hand and touched his bare chest. Silas looked up, surprised. "Silas," she said, "be my husband tonight." Her voice was thin and tight. "Right now, please." She did not wait for an answer. She pushed him back onto the pillows. She moved with a clumsy, frantic energy, her hands fumbling with his belt, her mouth against his neck. Silas was just stunned. He put his hands on her waist. "Clara, honey, wait. Slow down now." "No," she gasped. "No waiting." She was shaking all over, her eyes squeezed shut. "Just get it done. Just push through." It does not matter if it is hard, she thought. But as she tried to force herself, her body screamed no. Every single muscle locked up with old fear. Her breath came in short, sobbing gasps. Silas could feel the terror rolling off of her. This was not desire, not by a long shot. This was a sacrifice. She was offering herself up, and it was tearing her apart. He grabbed her wrists, stopping her. "Clara, stop it." "No," she cried, struggling against him. "I have to do this. I have to." She pulled loose. She tried to press against him one more time, but the touch sent a jolt of pure panic right through her. Her body recoiled. "It hurts," she choked out, the words tumbling out on their own. She shoved him and scrambled back against the headboard. Her chest was heaving, her eyes wide with the horror of her own failure. Silas sat up, his own heart pounding. The rejection, the confusion, the sheer craziness of it all, well, it broke something inside him. He felt helpless. He felt like a man dying of thirst being shown a poisoned well. He let out a roar of pure, angry frustration. He swung his fist and slammed it right into the log wall beside the bed with a loud crack. The sound cracked like a pistol shot in that little room, Clara hollered, curling up tight as a ball. Silas just stared at his own bleeding knuckles. He looked at his hand, then at the terror in his wife's eyes. She thought he'd finally become the monster. That truth hit him harder than any wall. He scrambled backward off the bed. "No," he rasped, the words caught in his throat. The fear that he could not control the anger inside him was choking. He turned and fled. He grabbed his boots and coat and ran out into the dark, windy night, not coming back till dawn. The days that followed felt like gray ash. The distance between them was no longer a small gap. It was a deep canyon. They moved around each other like ghosts. Silas slept in the barn for 3 nights. He told her a mare was sick. When he came back to the house, he slept on the floor by the fire. He could not bring himself to go into the bedroom. He could not face the look in her eyes. Clara moved through her chores like a machine, feeling completely hollowed out. She figured she had driven him away. Seeing his bandaged hand, guilt just ate her alive. They only spoke of things they had to. Silas was drowning in his own shame. He had scared her something awful. He lost control and ruined months of patience in a single second. He wanted to say he was sorry, but the word felt too small. And in their silence, predators began to circle. In the back of the church, Hiram Sterling sat with Reverend Prynne and a couple of elders. The Reverend looked mighty grave. "This is a difficult business, Brother Sterling," he said, "but the good book is clear. If there is no real union, there is no real marriage," Sterling finished. "And if there is no marriage," he continued, "then the deed to that land given to Silas Thorne and his heirs, well, that deed can be challenged." He leaned in, his voice a low whisper. "We have a moral duty to this community, Reverend. We cannot just let a man live in sin. Not with a woman who is not truly his wife." The Reverend pursed his lips and gave a slow nod. Sterling smiled. "Then I believe it is time we step in," he said, buttoning his coat. "For the sake of that rancher's soul, of course." The wind howled against the church walls. It seemed to carry the first whispers of the legal storm about to hit that quiet valley house. The silence in the ranch house was not empty at all. It was crowded with ghosts. Clara felt like she was walking underwater, the weight of her past pressing down on her. When she closed her eyes, she was not in Wyoming. She was in a little cabin back in Ohio. She could hear her father's heavy, stumbling footsteps, a man hollowed out by failure and corn whiskey. Her daddy saw his 4 girls as just extra mouths to feed, nothing more. He would holler about how useless they all were. He'd claim God was punishing him with daughters. So Clara just learned to make herself small and stay out of the way. She learned that a man's raised voice meant trouble was coming. But the fear that truly settled in her bones came later. It happened out on the Oregon Trail. They were about 3 weeks from independence when she met him. His name was Miller, a nasty fellow with grease under his nails and eyes that made her feel ashamed. One evening, he cornered her by the creek. She was just trying to fetch a bucket of water. He didn't say a word, just stank of chewing tobacco in the trail. The scrape of his coat was rough on her arm. He pinned her against a tree, his hands going where they had no business. Then he hissed in her ear. "Don't you scream," he said. "Nobody cares about a little stray like you." Clara just went cold and numb all over. It was like she was floating, watching it happen to some other poor girl. Then an older woman, Mrs. Gable, came down the path. She was singing a church song, and at the sound of her voice, Miller shoved Clara away and just disappeared. He hadn't finished his awful business, not really, but her body never forgot the feeling of being trapped. It was a cold memory, a wire pulled tight in her soul, just waiting to be tripped. So every time Silas moved a little too fast, or his big frame blocked the light, that wire snapped hard, and she was that scared girl by the creek and all over again. But Silas, he was haunted by his own ghosts. He rode the fence line all day and working until he ached, trying to outrun the man he used to be. He remembered the war at Vicksburg, the awful feeling of a fight. He'd done things to boys who were barely old enough to shave. In his rage and desperation, he had learned that violence was a quick and final tool. But the ghost that scared him most was Martha, his first wife. She was small like Clara, but full of fire. They argued one time back in those dark days after the war when he was drinking too much. She had shouted at him and he just reached out and grabbed her arm. But he was angry and far too strong. The next day, he saw the bruise, 5 ugly fingerprints turning purple on her pale arm. But what he really remembered was the look in her eyes just before she pulled away from him. It was pure fear. She was afraid of him. She died in childbirth just 6 months later, and he never got to apologize. He never got to wipe that look of fear from her memory. It was the last real thing between them. Now, when he looked at his own hand, the one that could split logs, he saw a weapon. He was terrified that the violence he'd learned wasn't just a tool, but a rot deep inside him. That's why he kept his distance from Clara. It's why he slept on the hard floor. He was trying to protect her, not just from his feelings, but from his very own nature. Sunday rolled around, a day for appearances. They rode to the church without a word. A mean wind whipped at the buggy cover. Reverend Prynne was already in fine form. He stood in that pulpit, and his voice boomed until his eyes found Silas and Clara. He quoted scripture, saying, "Wives, submit yourselves unto your own husbands, as unto the Lord." Prynne's voice thundered that the husband is the head of the wife, and a house divided cannot stand. He said a wife who withholds her duty is inviting evil right into her home. Then he dropped his voice to a whisper, and a husband who cannot rule his own house is a city with no walls. Weakness in the head leads to rot in the body. Folks started whispering and turning their heads. Clara felt a hot blush creep up her neck. She felt like everyone in that church was staring right through her, talking about her fear and calling it a sin. Silas sat there like he was carved from stone, his jaw set hard. He gripped his hat so tight his knuckles turned white. The ride home was silent and heavy. Back at the ranch, Clara went right to the kitchen and started supper, her hands moving way too fast. She chopped potatoes, the knife flashing, a terrible pressure building in her chest. Silas came in from the barn and just stood by the door watching her. "Clara," he said, his voice real quiet. That's when the knife slipped and nicked her finger. She dropped the knife with a clatter, stared at the drop of blood, and just broke down. It wasn't quiet crying this time. It was a painful wail of pure despair. She gripped the sink, her whole body shaken. "I cannot do it," she cried out. "I cannot be what they want, or what you want," she screamed when he stepped closer. Her eyes were wild. "You don't know what it's like," she said, trembling all over. My father, he told me I was useless because I was a girl, and then on the trail," the story just poured out of her. "That man, he cornered me by the creek. He put his hands on me. He told me no one would care," she sobbed, struggling for air. "I feel him every time you get close. When it gets dark, I feel his hands on me." "It is not you, Silas," she gasped. "It is not you, but my body. My body thinks it is him." She slid down to the floor, burying her face in her apron. "I am so sorry," she wailed. "I am just broken." Silas stood there, frozen, feeling like he'd been kicked in the stomach by a mule. Her words, "I feel his hands," started a white-hot rage burning inside him. But under that anger was a deep, aching sadness for his wife, huddled on the floor. He finally understood. She was not rejecting him. She was fighting a ghost every time he touched her. Her. He moved slow across the room, careful not to spook her. He knelt down, staying light on his feet. "Clara," he said, his voice all thick with emotion. She kept her head down. He reached out but stopped his hand. "Clara, look at me." Slowly she lifted her face. It was swollen, her eyes red and swimming with tears. She looked like a scared child. Silas swallowed hard. "Can I hold you?" he asked. She flinched. "Not like a husband," he said quickly. "Just like someone safe." Clara looked at him then, really looked, and saw the tears standing in his own eyes. This wasn't the hard rancher she knew. This man was hurting too. She gave a small nod. Silas moved slow, sitting on the floor beside her. He wrapped his arms around her, soft-like. He just made a shelter of his body and let her be. Clara tensed up for a moment, but there was no trap. There was just the steady thump of his heart against her ear. She let out a long, shaky breath and just fell into him. She buried her face in his shirt and cried, but these were cleansing tears, not bitter ones. He rested his chin on her head, rocking her gently. "He was wrong," Silas rumbled deep in his chest. "Your father was wrong about you. You are not useless. Not to me." He took a breath. "And I will never be a man like that. I swear to you, Clara." "I'd cut off my own hands first." They sat there for a long time on the kitchen floor. When the room got cold, he said gently, "Come on, you need your rest." He helped her up. Her legs were shaky. In the bedroom, he didn't put out the lamp right away. He sat on the edge of the bed. "I have my own ghosts, Clara," he finally said. His voice was low. He started talking about the war, about Vicksburg. He told her about the anger that lived in him, a dark thing he carried around. And then he told her about Martha. "I grabbed her," he whispered. "We were fighting. I grabbed her arm, and she looked at me, the same way you did when I hit that wall, like I was a monster." His eyes were dark with shame. "She died before I could make it right. I never got to say I was sorry. Never got to show her I could be gentle. I'm scared too, Clara. Scared of this part of me. Scared if I let myself want you. I might hurt you, and I don't think I could survive that again." Clara saw it then. He was just as afraid of his own strength as she was. He wasn't a monster. He was just a man terrified of becoming one. And in that moment, something inside her shifted. The loneliness was gone. They were just two hurt souls in a dark room trying to stay afloat. The old bed springs creaked as she moved and touched his arm. "Silas," she whispered, can we just lie here close without the rest of it?" He looked at her hand on his arm like it was a lifeline. "You mean just be still together?" "Yes, just close." He nodded slowly. "I would like that." He blew out the lamp. He got into bed, but this time he lay facing her. Her heart was just a hammering. She told herself he was safe, moving until her forehead rested against his broad chest. Silas lay perfectly still, letting her set the distance, letting her come to him. She laid her hand over his heart. "Can you hold me?" she whispered into the dark. He moved his arms so slowly, giving her every chance to back away if she wanted. When his arm finally settled on her waist, it was as light as a whisper. Clara let out a breath she had been holding for what felt like a month. The wind howled outside. He began tracing small circles on her back. "This okay?" he murmured against her hair. "Yes," she breathed. He brushed a stray piece of hair from her brow with his other hand. His fingers were rough from work, but his touch was gentle as he traced the line of her jaw. Clara closed her eyes. He was touching her face like he was trying to learn it by heart. Hours passed by under the silver moonlight. They did not sleep, just stayed there together. She traced an old scar on his wrist, and he held her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. He pulled her just an inch closer. She tensed for a second, then softened against him. He stopped right there and waited. "You all right?" he asked. "I'm all right," she said. The wanton was there, you could feel it in the air, a warmth deep in the blood. Silas felt it something fierce, but he pushed it down deep. He wrapped that feeling in tenderness, putting her peace and safety first. In his arms, that old rock of panic on Clara's chest finally started to crumble. She did not feel like something hunted. She felt, cherished, like a treasure. Near dawn, she shifted closer on her own, her knee brushing against his thigh. Silas kissed her forehead, her temple, and then her cheek, ever so gently. She turned her head, and their lips met. It was a soft question, not a demand. In the pale morning light, she pulled back a little. "Thank you," she whispered. A lump formed in his throat. She did not say she was sorry. She thanked him for his quiet strength. He pulled the quilt over her and whispered, "Get some sleep, Clara. I am right here." He held her through the night, watching the sun rise over the hard land. He was bone tired, but his heart felt lighter than it had in 10 long years. He had not taken anything. She had given freely. When Clara woke, Silas was already up and gone. She sat up, feeling a peaceful calm. For the first time in ages, she did not wake up afraid. In the kitchen, the coffee was already hot. She stepped to the door to look at her garden. Her hand flew to her mouth in shock. A surprise hard freeze had come in the night, turning her bean plants black and wilting the turnips. Her garden, the one thing she had wrestled from this tough soil, was completely gone. She knelt by the ruined plants and touched a blackened leaf. It turned to dust in her fingers. A sharp sorrow hit her. All that work, all that hope, wiped out in a single cold night. But as she knelt there in her grief, she realized something strange. She was not scared of this failure. The land was cruel, that was true. But inside her house, there was warmth. Inside, there was a good man who had simply held her. She looked toward the barn and heard the steady ring of his hammer. The garden was dead, but something else, something far more precious, had finally started to grow. Later that Tuesday, the sheriff arrived. Sheriff Miller rode a tired horse that matched the weary look on his own face. He was a decent man, but trying to keep the peace out here had worn him down. He handed Silas an envelope, but he could not look him in the eye. "It is a legal notice, Silas," the sheriff said, his voice low. "Hiram Sterling and the church elders filed it this morning. They are pushing it hard." Silas stood on his porch, his hand resting on his belt. He did not need to open the letter. "On what grounds?" Silas asked, his voice a low rumble, like a far-off storm. "Fraudulent contract," the sheriff mumbled. "They are claiming the deed requires an heir, or at least the prospect of one. And they say since the marriage ain't been made proper, it does not count." They were demanding an annulment to get the land back. Clara was in the doorway and heard every single word. The color drained from her face. But it was not shame she felt this time. It was a cold, clear shock that woke her up inside. She walked right out onto that porch. "They are using me to try and take this ranch," she said. It was not a question. Sheriff Miller tipped his hat, looking mighty uncomfortable. "Ma'am, it is just a legal trick. Sterling has been after your water rights. He is just using any lever he can find to get 'em." Clara saw Silas's hand, his knuckles white as he squeezed that envelope. All this time, she had blamed herself. She had carried her fear like a heavy stone, thinking it was her own private fault. A personal failure. But now she saw the truth of it. It was never just about her body. It was about power, plain and simple. Just like her daddy screaming about another mouth to feed. Or that man on the trail taking what he pleased because he was strong. Now a rich fella in a silk vest was doing the same. He was using her deepest hurt to try and steal her husband's land. Something inside her caught fire then. It was pure fury. She whispered, "They're using my sorrow against us." Silas looked over at her, expecting tears like always. He thought she'd just fall apart. But her eyes were bone dry. They were burning with a fire he had never seen before. He crushed the letter in his hand. "Let them trespass," Silas growled. "Come hell or high water. We will hold this land." Well, hell came calling just 3 nights later. The wind was dead still. The whole valley was quiet, with the moon tucked behind the clouds. Silas and Clara were in bed. They lay there holding hands in the dark, a small comfort they had started. Clara woke up to a terrible scream. It was not a person. It was a horse, panicked and terrified. Silas was already moving, pulling on his boots before his feet even hit the floor. "Fire!" he roared. Clara's heart jumped into her throat. She looked out the window. The night sky was a devilish orange. The barn was burning. They ran out into the heat. It hit them like a blast furnace. The old, dry barnwood was going up like kindling. Flames shot up toward the hayloft. If that hay caught fire, it was all over. "The horses!" Clara screamed. Jeb and the young ranch hand, Toby, were already there. Covered in soot, they were fighting to get the corral gate open for the horses. Silas did not stop for a bucket. He ran right into that smoking barn. "Silas!" Clara cried out in fear. She grabbed a burlap sack, soaked it in the horse trough, and ran right for the flames. The heat burned her face and the air was thick with smoke. Then Silas came out of the smoke. He was leading a spooked horse, his coat thrown over its head. He shoved it towards the pasture. Then he turned to go back in. "The roof!" Jeb shouted. "It's coming down!" The roar of the fire was deafening. You could hear timber cracking and coyotes howling at the chaos. "Get water on the north wall," Silas yelled, his voice raw, "or we are going to lose the house." For an hour they fought that fire with everything they had. Clara worked like a woman possessed. She hauled buckets until her arms burned, dousing the smoking walls of their house. She stomped out every spark that hit the dry grass. Her dress was ruined, her face black with soot. But she never stopped for a second. She was defending her home. Then the barn roof finally gave way. The barn collapsed with a sound like thunder, sending sparks flying into the dark Texas sky. With nothing left to burn, the fire finally started to die. Silas stood by the water trough, gasping for air. He wiped a muddy hand across his face, looking at the ruin of what he'd built. Then he looked out towards the dark ridge. The fire had started on the far side, away from any lantern. This was no accident. A shadow moving in the brush caught his eye. It was a man, slipping away toward the road. A cold focus washed over Silas. He knew that shape. He even recognized the man's limp as he tried to get on his horse. It was a hired hand from the Double Bars Ranch. Silas grabbed his Winchester rifle from the porch. "Silas!" Clara called out, her voice shaking. He paid her no mind. He chambered around with a sharp click that cut through the dying crackle of the fire. He raised the rifle and months of pure rage boiled up inside him. All the whispers, the doctor's lies, and the world trying to crush his wife came to a head. He had the man dead in his sights. It was a long shot, but Silas Thorne did not miss. He was going to end the man who tried to burn them out of their home. He wanted this finished. His finger tightened on the trigger, his whole world narrowing to that one single point. "Silas." The voice was quiet, but it was a command. Clara was right there beside him. She just put her hand on his arm. "Silas, look at me." But he wouldn't. "He burned our barn, Clara," he growled. "I know," she said, her voice steady as a rock. "But if you do this, you ain't protecting us. You're destroying everything we are." "He deserves it," Silas hissed. "Maybe he does," Clara said. "But you're not a killer. You told me you'd never be that man again. Don't let them make you that man. Don't let Sterling turn you into a murderer. That's exactly what he wants. He wants you to hang." The words cut through his anger. If he killed that man, Sterling would have him. The ranch would be gone, and Clara would be all alone. Silas started to tremble. He wanted justice so bad it hurt. "Silas, please," Clara whispered. "Come on back to me." Slowly, so slowly, Silas lowered the rifle. A long, shuddering breath left his body. He watched the rider disappear into the night. Then he turned and looked at his wife. She was covered in soot, but her eyes were clear and fierce. She had saved him from himself. He dropped the rifle in the dirt and pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. He choked out. "I know," she said, holding on tight. By morning, the whole valley smelled of wet ash. Then Sheriff Miller arrived. He rode out to the charred remains of his barn and found tracks from a Shaw horse. He also found a rag soaked in kerosene. Miller spat and said it was arson for sure. Silas said flatly it was one of Sterling's men. But Miller asked, "Can you prove it?" "I saw enough," Silas said. Miller shook his head. "That is not proof in a court of law, son. Not in a town where the judge is in the bank's pocket." The sheriff looked plain tired. "If you go after him, you lose everything. Sterling is counting on you losing your temper." "So what do we do?" Clara asked, cleaning soot from a lantern. "Just let him burn us down?" "No," Miller said. "You fight him at the church council meeting tomorrow night. Sterling will be there. He expects you to be ashamed. He expects you to be quiet." He looked at Clara. "He expects you to be silent." The church was hot and packed full. It seemed the whole town of Bitter Creek had turned out to watch the spectacle. Silas and Clara sat up front, not touching, but both sitting proud with their spines straight. Across the aisle sat Hiram Sterling, looking cool and collected in a gray suit. He had a lawyer from Cheyenne with him, a man with a face like a weasel. Reverend Prince stood at the pulpit, looking burdened by his own sense of right. "We are here," the Reverend began, "to address a serious spiritual and legal matter. The sanctity of marriage is the very bedrock of our community. It cannot be mocked. When a contract is made in bad faith, the elders must investigate." He nodded to the lawyer. The lawyer stood up, his voice slick as oil. "Mr. Thorne," he began, "you entered a marriage contract with this woman 3 months ago, is that right?" "It is," Silas said, "and that marriage, according to the deed for your land, requires the production of heirs." "The purpose was to take a wife," Silas said flatly. The lawyer gave a thin smile. "Let us be direct," he said. "Has this marriage been consummated in the biblical sense?" The room went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop on cotton. Silas felt that old anger rising, but he remembered Clara's steady hand on his arm. "That is a private matter," Silas said, his voice low. "It is a public matter when land is involved." The lawyer snapped. "If you have not vetted her, the marriage is a fraud, a sham. It is a trick to keep the bank from what it is owed. So you answer the question. Is she your wife, or is she just a squatter in your house? Or is she defective?" That ugly word just hung there in the hot air. Silas's hands balled into fists as he began to rise, his face turning a deep, angry red. "Sit down, Silas." The voice was soft, but it cut through the noise. Clara stood up. She had on her best gray dress, the one she was married in, now all clean and pressed. She looked tiny in front of that big wooden cross, but her chin was up. She looked at the lawyer, then she looked at Sterling. Then she turned to face all the townspeople, seeing Mrs. Gable, the blacksmith, and the women who whispered about her in the store. "I will answer," Clara said. A gasp went through the room. You see, women did not speak in these matters, especially a woman at the center of such a big scandal. Clara's heart hammered in her chest and her knees felt weak. But then she remembered something. She remembered the heat on her face as she ran into that fire. She remembered the feel of Silas's steady heartbeat when he held her. "My husband and I have not shared a bed," Clara said, her voice shaking at first. Then it grew strong. "Not yet." Murmurs filled the church. Sterling just smirked. "Because I asked him not to." Clara went on, stepping into the aisle. "I came here from a very hard life, with scars on my soul that are as real as a brand on a longhorn. I was taught that men's hands were only for taking, only for hurting." She looked right at Mrs. Gable. "You whisper that I am cold, that I am broken. You say I'm hiding some great sin." She paused. "I am hiding fear. That is all. I was terrified. When I came to his home, I flinched at every move he made. I expected to be treated poorly and cast aside." She turned to Silas. He looked at her with so much pride and love, it gave her the courage to keep going. "But this man, the one you call a fraud, he never forced me. He could have. The law gives him that right. The doctor said he should, but he did not." She faced the crowd again. "He waited. He slept on the floor. He held me when I cried. He chose to be gentle when he could have been rough. You ask if he is my husband? He saved my life in a blizzard. He saved our animals from a fire while you all slept. He has healed me, not by taking but by giving." Her voice rang out clear as a bell. "Building a real marriage. It is not finished, but it is true. It's more true than any contract signed with ink. It is built on trust. And that is our business, not yours to judge." She finished, and the room was completely silent. Sterling's lawyer cleared his throat, looking rattled. "A touching speech, ma'am, but legally, you are the one on shaky ground, counselor." Sheriff Miller stood up from a back pew. He walked down the aisle, his spurs clinking. "I found some kerosene rags at that barn," Miller said, looking Sterling dead in the eye. "And I found tracks that match a horse from the Double Bar's bunkhouse." Sterling's smirk disappeared. "That is slander, Sheriff." "No, it is an investigation," Miller corrected him. "And it seems mighty peculiar that a fire starts right when you are trying to force a sale." Miller then turned to the Reverend. "Are you really going to end a marriage because a man is treating his wife with kindness? Decency. Are you really going to give this land to a man who likely hired an arsonist? Is that what passes for justice here?" The Reverend looked from Sterling to Silas. Then his eyes settled on the women of the congregation. Their faces were no longer filled with judgment. Now he saw understanding. They knew a hard life. They knew what it meant to be at the mercy of certain men, and they saw something rare in Silas Thorne, a man who put a woman's spirit above his own rights. A soft murmur moved through the pews. "He is a good man," a woman's voice called. It was the blacksmith's wife. "Let them be," a ranch hand shouted from the back. The Reverend cleared his throat, glancing down at his papers, then at Sterling, who was pale and stone-faced. "The council finds no grounds for annulment," the Reverend said quietly. "The marriage stands. What passes between a man and wife is a private matter." Sterling shot to his feet, glaring first at Silas, then at Clara. "This is not over," he hissed. Silas simply replied, "It is for today, Hiram." Sterling stormed out of the church, his lawyer scrambling to keep up. The hearing then broke into conversation. The tension was gone. Clara felt her knees buckle as the adrenaline left her. In an instant, Silas was there to catch her. He wrapped his big coat around her shoulders. He leaned close, his lips brushing her ear. "I have never in my life been prouder of anyone," he whispered. "You are magnificent." Clara looked up at him, her eyes shining with tears. "We won," Silas said, a grin spreading across his face. They walked out of the church into the blinding sunlight. The wind caught Clara's dress, but she just leaned into Silas, feeling the solid warmth of his side. The town of Bitter Creek went on with its Patie, but as they walked, everything felt different. Clara knew the town no longer had any power over her. She had spoken her truth, and in the light her shame had simply disappeared. She looked at Silas, who was truly smiling. "Let's go home," he said. "Yes," Clara answered softly. "Let's go home." They climbed into the wagon, leaving all the whispers and judgments behind them in the dust. Their faces turned toward the open range and a future that was finally theirs. Summer arrived like a hammer blow. The Wyoming high plains turned into a furnace. By July of 1879, the sun was a blazing fire in the sky. It bleached the color from the sagebrush and baked the earth as hard as iron. The wind did not stop, it just turned meaner, a dry breath that stole the moisture from your skin. It carried clouds of fine alkali dust that coated everything in a layer of gray. It was the kind of weather that sent weaker folks packing. But on the Thorne Ranch, it did not break them. It forged them. The barn, half burnt from the fire, had to be rebuilt before the autumn rains. It was brutal, back-breaking work. Silas went to the high gullies to fell timber, hauling logs down with his team. Powerful draft horses. Clara worked right alongside him, learning to strip bark from pine logs until her arms were strong. She mixed the mud chinking, working it into the cracks with her bare hands. They fell into a silent rhythm. The Texas heat was too much for small talk, but they understood each other without a word. When Silas paused, Clara was already there with a dipper of cool water. When she struggled with a heavy beam, Silas's hands would be there to help lift, not to take over, but to help. They were a team now, bound by survival, and the folks in Bitter Creek watched them with a new, weary respect. That church meeting where Clara stood up to Hiram Sterling? Well, that story had made its rounds. The gossip did not stop, of course, but it was not mean-spirited anymore, just curious. One hot Tuesday, Clara took the wagon to town. She held her head high, expecting the usual silence. As she stepped into the general store, she saw Mrs. Higgins at the counter. The blacksmith's wife turned. "Mighty hot day for a ride," she said. Clara paused. "Sure is," she answered carefully. "The dust is something else." Mrs. Higgins nodded, then pulled a small paper packet from her basket. "My hollyhocks did real good this year," she said, holding it out. "Figured you might could use these. Heard you lost your beans to the frost." It was more than just seeds. It was an olive branch, an acceptance. She was one of them now. "Thank you," Clara said, her voice thick. "I will plant them by the porch." Mrs. Higgins gave a real tired smile. "They like the morning sun. And tell your husband, those hinges are ready." Outside, young Toby, who had helped with the pier, was loading her flour. When she tried to pay him, he just shook his head and tipped his hat. "No, ma'am. Mr. Thorne looked after me last winter. I reckon I owe him some work." "You just worry about getting that barn built." Clara drove home feeling lighter. The wall of isolation was finally starting to crack. They were earning their place, not by giving in, but by standing strong. The evenings became their sanctuary. When the sun set, the brutal heat would finally break, leaving the air sweet, with the scent of cooling sage. They sat on the porch, Silas in his rocker and Clara on the steps. The quiet between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was the easy silence of two folks who'd worked the same dirt all day. Slow but sure, they started to understand what was in each other's hearts. They finally talked about things that used to be too hard to say. "Tell me about the war," Clara asked one evening. "Not the fighting," she said, "the other parts." Silas rocked slow. "The coffee was awful," he said, his voice low. "Tasted like mud, but getting a letter, that was like holding a piece of the sun. I kept one from my brother in my pocket for 6 months. Just the feel of the paper was like home." He paused for a moment. "I reckon that's why I wanted this place to be so strong. A place that couldn't be blown away. A place where what's yours stays yours." Clara nodded. "I never had a pocket," she said softly. "My dresses were my sister's cast-offs. Nothing was ever truly mine." She looked right at him. "When you gave me that ring, it was the first thing I ever owned that was just for me. Even if I was too spooked to wear it right." Silas stopped his rocking. "You wear it right, Clara. Better than anyone." They talked about being scared too. Not the big freezing fear from before, but the small daily worries. Silas admitted he feared getting old and useless, unable to even lift a saddle. Clara said she was scared of thunder, how it sounded like the good Lord himself was mad. And then, careful-like, they talked about desire. Silas told her he loved to watch her brush her hair by lamplight. He said the copper shine of it made his heart ache in a good way. Clara told him, blushing, that she liked his strong forearms when he'd roll up his sleeves to chop wood. Each confession was another brick laying a foundation of trust. They were turning a scary mystery into just a simple conversation between a man and a woman. August rolled in, hot and golden. The barn was finished, smelling of fresh pine. One night after a long day, they washed the dust from their skin. The house was still, with just the wind whispering outside. Clara stood in the bedroom in her white nightgown. She felt a change in herself tonight. Under the tiredness was a warmth that had been growing for weeks. She thought of Silas, strong and steady. She thought of him holding her through her nightmares. And she thought of the hunger in his eyes, a hunger he kept reined in just for her. And she knew all of a sudden that the reins weren't needed anymore. The fear was a scar, yes, but it was no longer a wall between them. She trusted him with her life. It was time to trust him with the rest of her. Silas walked into the room, hair damp and wearing a clean shirt. He reached to blow out the lamp. "Leave it on," Clara said. He froze and turned to look at her. "Silas," she said, her voice clear as a bell. "I want to see you," bowed against her heart. "And I want you to see me." She stepped toward him. "I want to try again, Silas. Tonight." Silas just looked at her, his dark eyes searching her face for the truth. He saw she was nervous, but determined. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "We can wait." "I am certain," she said, "but we have to go slow. You have to let me lead, and if I say stop, we stop." Silas answered right away. "The second you even think it, I'll stop, I promise." He stood perfectly still, letting her be the one to close the space between them. Clara stopped right in front of him. She reached up and unbuttoned the top of his shirt. Her fingers brushed his warm skin. She could feel the steady heat coming off him. She looked into his eyes. He was holding his breath. His hands open at his sides. He was showing her he wouldn't grab, wouldn't take. She took his hands and put them on her own waist. "Hold me," she whispered. Silas's large hands settled on her hips, his touch gentle as a prayer. He pulled her just a little bit closer. Clara closed her eyes, bracing for the panic, for the awful memory to come back. A flicker of that old fear did come, but then she smelled the clean soap on Silas's skin. She felt his calloused thumbs rubbing her waist in slow circles. She heard him breathing, trying to keep it steady for her. "This is Silas," she told herself, "the man who slept on the floor to make me feel safe." And the shadow backed away. She moved even closer, pressing her body to his. She felt a shiver run right through him. "Kiss me," she said, her voice quiet but sure. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a simple peck, but a kiss full of deep, held-back feeling. His mouth was warm and kind. They moved toward the bed. It wasn't some grand romance, but a quiet agreement made with care. Silas let her set the pace. With every move, his eyes asked her, "Is this okay?" At one point, his weight shifted over her, and that old terror shot through her like lightning. "Wait," she choked out, her whole body going stiff. Silas froze in an instant. He held himself up on his elbows. "I'm right here," he whispered. "Look at me, Clara." She looked up at him. His eyes were full of want, but also full of kindness. He was there with her. "I'm okay," she breathed, feeling the panic wash away. "I'm okay." She pulled him down to her. When they were finally one, it was not him taking something. It was a gift she was given. It was Clara finally choosing to let her walls come down. It hurt for a moment, and she cried out. But then came a feeling of being whole. Silas held her like she was the most precious thing in the world. He murmured to her the whole time, kind words, loving words that kept her right there with him. "You are so brave," he whispered into her hair. "So beautiful." When it was over, Clara didn't pull away. She cried, not from shame, but from pure, sweet relief. Silas gently kissed the tears from her face. "Away." "Thank you," she whispered, and the words meant so much more this time. Silas wrapped the quilt around them, pulling her close. The wind outside no longer sounded like a threat. It sounded like a sweet song. They fell asleep like that, the barrier between them finally gone. But life in the West did not just become easy. A week after the barn was done, one of their best horses stepped in a gopher hole. The horse broke its leg, and Silas had the hard job of putting him down. Clara said nothing. She just made him coffee and held his hand on the porch. Then big storms rolled in, threatening to ruin the last of the hay. They fought the wind for 3 days straight, covering the stacks until their hands were raw. And Hiram Sterling was still around. He still ran the bank and owned the water rights. He would ride past their property now and then, just watching them. But he saw how they worked together and how the whole town supported them. He saw the look in Silas's eyes, a look that said he would protect Clara at all costs. Sterling was a smart man. He knew when to cut his losses, so he finally rode away. When September came, Clara started to feel a change in herself. She felt a little dizzy in the mornings, and the smell of bacon made her feel sick. A deep tiredness settled in her bones, different from the hard work she was used to. One evening, Silas watched her sewing by the fire. It was a piece of white flannel. "What are you making?" he asked her, setting down his ledger. She held up the piece of clothing. It was a shirt, but it was doll-sized. Silas went completely still. His pen left a blot of ink on the page. "Clara," he said. She smiled at him. "I think," she said, "we are going to need more wood for a cradle." Silas stood up, crossed the room, and fell to his knees beside her. He put his large, calloused hand on her stomach. "Are you certain?" he asked. "I'm not certain," she said, "but I have a feeling. I just feel full." Silas buried his face in her lap, and his shoulders shook with quiet, grateful tears. He thought the Thorne family name was going to end with him. "We will be good parents," Clara whispered, gently stroking his hair. "We will be gentle," Silas replied, looking up at her. "We will teach them they are precious." Then October rolled in with one last gully washer of a storm. It rained hard for 2 straight days, a final tantrum before winter. When it finally stopped, Silas and Clara stepped onto their porch. The air was cold and clean, smelling of wet pine and rich Texas earth. Far off, quiet lightning lit up the breaking clouds in the west. It felt more like a goodbye salute than a threat. Silas wrapped his arms around Clara, his hands resting on her belly. She looked out at the tough land and wasn't afraid of it anymore. "Look at them stars," Silas whispered. The sky opened up, showing a river of stars like diamond dust. It was a beautiful, powerful sight. Clara took a deep breath. "It's going to be a cold winter," she said. "Let it come," Silas told her. "We've got plenty of wood, and we've got each other." His face was weathered by the sun, but his eyes were kind and clear. "I love you, Silas," she said the first time she'd ever said it. He smiled wide. "I love you, Clara, more than anything." They stood there a long while, just two people against the giant western sky. They had been through so much to find this quiet, peaceful moment. A soft wind rocked an empty chair, a whisper of the life they were building. It was a wild land, but their little home was filled with peace. Thank you for listening, friends. I hope this story of Silas and Clara touched your heart. It shows that even in the toughest country, a tender heart can find a home. I would sure love to hear from y'all. Leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to From Wild West for more stories from the frontier. I truly appreciate you spending this time with me.